Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Corrupt Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2008 biographical comedy drama titled W. Now, W runs for 2 hours and 9 minutes long. It is directed by Oliver Stone. The script was done by Stanley Weiser. It is produced by Bill Block, Eric Kopoloff, Paul Hansen, and Moritz Bormann. It is composed by Paul Cantillon, the cinematography by Pheidon Papamichael Jr., and it was edited by Julie Monroe, Joe Hutching, and Alexis Chavez. And the stars of the movie are Josh Brolin, Elizabeth Banks, James Cromwell, Richard Dreyfuss, Jeffrey Wright, Thandiwe Newton, Ellen Burstyn, Scott Glenn, Toby Jones, Bruce McGill, Ioan Gruffudd, Noah Wyle, Rob Corddry, Dennis Boutsikaris, Randall Newsome, Jason Ritter, Michael Gaston, Tom Kemp, Paul Ray, Stacy Keach, Jesse Bradford, Marley Shelton, Anna Presley, Syed Badreya, William Chan, Teresa Chung, Colin Hanks, Bryan Massey, Brent Sexton, and Charles Fathy. So, what did I think of this movie? Well, okay. Make no mistake about it, Oliver Stone's W is a fascinating biopic based on the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. I was completely invested in how Bush transformed himself from an alcoholic college slacker to becoming the leading politician in America. Did it, maybe some people got pissed off from both ends of the political spectrum, and you know what? That's fine. Everybody sees things differently, and I'm glad that Oliver Stone kind of took that direction. It wasn't like Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, where he just completely ripped apart George W. Bush throughout. No, Oliver Stone wanted to do a fair depiction of him, even though it still kind of pissed off both the Republicans and the Democrats. In the case of the Republicans, they were pissed off because they portrayed George W. Bush as a weak, vulnerable person who had really no real great political experience being pushed into the role as president, and that he wasn't really quite ready or really that great of a competent leader. They portray him as being just a guy who just called the shots, while his administration was the one that was doing the more heavy-handed stuff. George W. Bush just got all the credit because he was the leader. You know, he was just almost like a child pushed into the wrong group of people. To counteract that, the Democrats probably wanted another Michael Moore type docudrama portraying George W. Bush as a self-absorbed monster who was behind 9/11 and just wanted to push a political agenda to finish off where his pappy started by capturing Saddam Hussein and sentencing him to execution, while also starting a war in, hey, guess what? Another Middle Eastern country. Whereas George Herbert Walker Bush, his country of choice was Iraq. George W. Bush chose Afghanistan to look for weapons of mass destruction, which all ended up becoming just a fallacy because there was no weapons of mass destruction. So the Democrats wanted to see more ripping of him. But hey, Michael Moore already did it. So I guess probably to avoid some kind of paraphrasing or plagiarism Oliver Stone wanted to keep George as a solid, everyday individual. Just, coasting through his 8 years in the office as America's president. Like everyone else, George W. Bush, he had very big shoes to follow, and they were not always met with complete approval or support, especially from his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, who for many years was in the political spectrum. Long before that, he was a big rig oil tycoon who was in the oil industry and then turned to politics and served, 8 years as vice president under Ronald Reagan and then would later become president and would serve 4 years there from 1989 to 1993. Of course, this movie portrays George Herbert Walker Bush as a guy who seemed to be more lenient towards his younger son Jeb as being brushed to become the next president, and did not have too much high expectations for George W. Bush. And Oliver Stone, Mr. Stone himself, made him into a more sympathetic character. So, following his journey, he was faced with constant quarrels with his father, even having bad dreams about him getting into a bit of a physical confrontation with him. And he seemed to favor, like I said, his brother Jeb, and that Bush had to push overwhelming obstacles to finally win the approval of his family and to show the world that he is not a loser. Of course, the road wasn't easy. I mean, they do kind of a bit of a twofold story here. Some of them they chronicle, from his early years in the 60s as a college slacker who spent most of his time with the sorority boys getting drunk and getting laid. And then we look at him during his times as president with his staff going over issues, like the war in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan and the search for weapons of mass destruction, and to pretty much finish off where his father started by capturing Saddam Hussein, sentencing him to a trial where he'd inevitably be put to death. So basically, that's what it was. It was basically just a legacy to fill in. I mean, just like his father, he was just as much of a warmonger as George Herbert Walker Bush was. Except that in George Herbert Walker Bush's case, because he was in the oil industry and the United States was losing its oil intakes. So what's the best thing to do? Go to a Middle Eastern country that's saturated with oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Oman, Iran, but mostly Iraq, to take down an evil dictator like Saddam Hussein and bring him to justice. But of course, that was just a distraction. All he just wanted was oil. He just wanted more oil. Because he was a big rig oil tycoon in the Houston, Texas area. And that's basically what his main interest was. And what's the best way to do it? Start a war. That's what got the Gulf War started. I mean, many people have often claimed that in the conspiracy theories that George W. Bush was the guy who pushed the envelope for 9/11. And that the 9/11 terrorist attacks was all orchestrated by George W. Bush just to go to Afghanistan to look for weapons of mass destruction. That's what people have often thought he was. Now, personally, in my opinion, it's not that I had a problem with the whole man child got lucky type of situation that George W. Bush faced, or the fact that he had to overcome several obstacles to get to where he was. It's just that I kind of felt it was a little too soon to be doing a biopic on him. And when this movie came out in 2008, he was still in office. They could have waited another 10 years for this biopic to get underground. Because there was still some life left in him as president before Barack Obama took his place. But what differs W from Stone's other presidential biopics like JFK and Nixon is that it refrains from revising any of the events that happened in Bush's life. This movie was kind of more played for satire, so to speak. Everything at most feels very accurate, almost as though it was narrated by the sides and the cohorts who worked with Bush during his 8 years in the White House. Sure, I understand that not everything said behind closed doors was completely accurate, because when the doors are shut, nobody knows what the fuck is going on. Stone, along with his co-writer Stanley Weiser, gave a fairly descriptive interpretation of what was said during his reign. And the good news is about this movie is that it wasn't malicious. It wasn't a brutal attack or just ripping him apart. No, we had Michael Moore to do that. But it wasn't also saturine either. They're not looking at him as a complete sympathetic individual. But it was something we seem to expect from Bush and his staff. I mean, maybe they're the ones who injected this poison into his brain and he just went along. I mean, giving us the impression that he was just a gullible individual who can give somebody a high five and then they would slap him back and say, keep the change. The whole movie is pretty much focused on George W. Bush, played by Josh Brolin, as we see him through the many important stages in his life. From being an inebriated college student to the frustrating constant bickering from his father. Because, like every good movie that we see, we always have to have that old cliche daddy issues. Towards his many addictions like cocaine, skirt chasing, and alcohol, to him getting married to Laura Bush, becoming a father, cleaning up his act, finding God, finding marriage, making it into politics, becoming governor, and finally becoming the president. We see all that in one stage, and then another side of the movie, we look through his what he was doing in his office in the office during his years as president. Not only do we get a glimpse of his early years pertaining to his presidential era, but we get a behind the scenes look at what was talked about and mentioned behind the desk of his staff and his administration and the people who influenced him in his decision making during his reign. We see that a lot of his choices were backed by tyrannical warmongers like Vice President Dick Cheney, played by Richard Dreyfuss, and political advisor Karl Rove, played by Toby Jones, along with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, played by Scott Glenn. Now, if there were any weaknesses to the movie, one has to wonder what motivated them to declare war on Afghanistan. I made a mistake. I said Iraq. That's the other Bush. That's Senior. That's Poppy Bush. Also, some of the actors had very little material to work on. I mean, although Secretary of State General Colin Powell, played by Jeffrey Wright, seems to be the one who seems to have the strongest moral character depicted in the movie, he really had very little to do but to contradict this whole war in Afghanistan, saying that it's not a good idea and that they should reconsider. And the United States National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, played by Thandiwe Newton, who's practically just a corporate yes woman. Of course, eventually she took over Colin Powell's position as Secretary of State. Still, she really didn't have very much to do. The administration was pretty much one-dimensional, as they were pretty much used as foils to defer and place ideas in Bush's already fractured ego. Cheney definitely has the calm approaching pitch and voice to manipulate Bush that war is not optional and that the whole world is counting on him to put an end to Saddam Hussein's tyranny from using these alleged weapons of mass destruction. And while Rove has been a tactical representative to other leaders in the past, Bush relies on him to get a message across to the people on all media platforms. And then, of course, there's him to try to win the approval of his father, who has disapproved him for so many years. Even when he became president, George Bush Sr. was like, oh God, him. Bush's personal struggles are met quite roughly due to never ending verbal lashings of his disapproving father, George H.W. Bush, played by James Cromwell, and his mother, Barbara, played by Ellen Burstyn. He always felt they favored his more clean-cut younger brother, Jeb, over him, even feeling that they didn't go to Jeb's inauguration when he was elected governor, while Junior was elected governor of Texas almost around the same time. They never delve into Bush's childhood years, which is a good thing because we don't really need to go that far. But we get fragments of Bush struggling with his life on the Yale campus, while due to his alcoholic frenzies, we have to wait until he was 40 years old when he got off the bottle and found a new faith in Jesus. Sure, he may have once in a while took a drink, but it wasn't like frequent. Before then, he was chasing women. He couldn't hold down jobs, especially going into the oil plants, doing the rigging. He was crashing cars and getting scolded by George Sr. You know, It was during the time when he entered Congress that he met his future wife, Laura Welsh, played by Elizabeth Banks, at a party. And while they spoke, their feelings for each other became more passionate. I mean, it was her who kind of inspired him to get off the bottle. Sure, once in a while he might have a couple of non alcoholic beverages or ones that are a little lighter in alcoholic content. But it wasn't like him doing it gratuitously. Which seems kind of strange because at one time she was on the voluntary committee when Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy was trying to run for president. So she was originally a Democrat, but then when she started to when she married George W. Bush, who was a Republican, because his brother was a Republican, his father was a Republican. When she did come, and then I kind of ask my question is, when did she convert to become a Republican? Or was she a Democrat but just sort of supported Bush in his Republican ways? Maybe she was always been a Democrat. Maybe she was always been a Democrat but just still supported Bush in his Republican beliefs. Or maybe she just became a middle ground moderate, or maybe just an egalitarian who just looked through both sides equally without any judgment. Maybe that's what she did. I don't know. We never fully know because here George and Laura really never discuss politics with each other, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's obviously good to not bring your work home. Banks portrays Laura as the catalyst in turning his life around. She was soft spoken, patient, intelligent, educated, supportive, and was just who Bush needed to gain confidence in himself, which was missing because everyone else in his life, especially in his father, had not given it to him, nor really has the public spectrum. They never really had that much confidence in him. Hell, people have often labeled him as a moron. She was also an advocate for Al-Anon, an organization designed for spouses to get off the addiction by way of the 12-step program. And sure, Bush may have gone cold turkey with his addiction and became a born-again Christian. There were some scenes that saw Bush occasionally having a beer. I mean, okay, fine. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Just because you're no longer an alcoholic doesn't mean you can't have at least one. Yes, I understand. Even recovering alcoholics might have the occasional drink, but according to resources, Bush was only gulping down non alcoholic beverages known as O'Doul's. And yeah, of course, they also brought up about him almost choking to death on a pretzel, but somehow managed to resuscitate himself. Sorry, Cheney, your ticket to presidency is not likely going to happen. But once he became clean, he was able to become more responsible and was able to maintain steady employment. And sure, scenes cut from the past and into the present quite frequently. Stone chooses to highlight more into the personality of the younger Bush and not focus too much on his career as a politician, even though we see a lot of the behind closed doors stuff in him giving the final go. And even with his hasty decisions about how to handle the war in Afghanistan are met with him being oblivious to his strategy, but having that great level of intensity, he was determined to stick with his plans, regardless of whether his choices will succeed or backfire. When the news broke out that there were no weapons of destruction in Afghanistan, he was irate and was never informed. Does that make him gullible? Maybe. Is it all him? Is it all he to blame? No. There were like 9 or 10 cabinet administrators that were behind all this. In the end, they were all guilty. However, the administration did inform him earlier. He just felt that since he was the leader of the country, he dismissed them entirely. Powell, who strongly opposed the Afghani war, would try to softly explain the repercussions of what would happen if a war like this would occur. But sadly, he had for the most part kept silence, unless he really needed to speak out. There was never any indication of his resignation in 2005. See, a lot of this movie seems to be problematic in terms of being at times a bit underdeveloped, because most of the characters were often depicted as one dimensional. There are many characters in that movie that are very hard to like. And even old W himself can be a bit nauseating at times. We see Bush leave his Texas ranch and jog out in the hot Texas sun, wearing sweat clothes and coming home drenched in sweat. There's mention of Cheney having 3 heart attacks while in office. I mean, do people ever actually check people's medical records to see if they are actually in physical shape to play an important role in the Oval Office? And Condoleezza Rice, dressed without workplace footwear, acting nothing more than like a corporate yes woman, brown nosing sycophant. It also feels quite disturbing that his parents didn't fully support Bush when he became governor of Texas, being more upset with him than when he was a drunk. It was upsetting when Cheney was trying to go over matters with Bush on his strategic plans and offered suggestions only to be dismissed because he's not running the show, Bush is. And he actually sometimes even tells that, like, Cheney, you're below me. I call the shots. Not you. That's kind of sometimes a little cringe inducing in terms of the dialogue. The physical characteristics of the performers in their respective roles on the plus side do tend to look and act almost like the characters they portray. The best one definitely has to be Richard Dreyfuss as Vice President Dick Cheney. I assume there wasn't much of a hair and makeup job needed on Dreyfuss to play Cheney. Honorable mentions go out to James Cromwell as George Sr., even though the real George Herbert Walker Bush was not as tall or intimidating as the real one, but the accent and mannerisms are something we would expect. He did show some signs of compassion towards Junior when he gave him a pair of cuffs that his father, Senator Prescott Bush, gave him many years ago, and that he too had a toxic relationship with his own father. So all this tough love stuff wasn't just because he wanted to be vile and mean spirited. But it was because his own father gave him the same shit as well. So aside from partaking in a war that was never meant to be and sending the economy in a downward spiral, George W. Bush was portrayed as a more sympathetic soul instead of a moronic warmonger, like the documentary Michael Moore did for Fahrenheit 9/11. Though he is portrayed to be incompetent as a president, being influenced by master manipulators like Karl Rove and Dick Cheney, who was actually pulling the strings at the White House. The only thing we can praise Bush for was his not so stellar performance in those 8 years in office, but he doesn't really know that. We were only following God's word. So, overall, would I recommend this movie? I guess to some extent, yes. If you're expecting it to be a 100% accurate depiction, no, it's actually more satirical than compared to JFK and Nixon, but it's still, effective. Even though I think the movie probably may have came out a little too soon. And maybe it should have been, it would have been better if it would have been like maybe 10 years from now, not while he was still in office. Do it when his term was over. Maybe even make it into a miniseries. That would have been somewhat sufficient. But it's still a great watch. I thought the performances were good. Sure, some could have been more developed. So therefore, if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give W from 2008 a 7.5 out of 10. So I guess that ends my Wright review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. Just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Wright saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.